Hello there, everyone. I am your host, the Sea Monster, and I would like to welcome you all to my essay video series on Pacific Rim Uprising. For those who may or may not be familiar with this film, Pacific Rim Uprising, directed as well as co-written by Stephen S. DeKnight, is the 2018 sequel to Guillermo del Toro's 2013 film Pacific Rim. Just to give a little bit of backstory, I do consider the first Pacific Rim to be pretty good overall. While I wouldn't call it a personal favorite of mine, it's a film that is strongly bolstered by its grand visual spectacle and some great character work. The sequel, though, that's a different story. Despite not being super passionate about the first film, I still have a strong vested interest in covering the second on this channel. In fact, when I started this channel, Pacific Rim Uprising was one of the movies that I wanted to do the most, including but not limited to the MonsterVerse films, Shin Godzilla, and The Mummy 2017. And it's been a long time coming to finally do a series on this film. I meant to give the film a revisit alongside the first movie, which I will be referencing quite a bit throughout this series. When I first watched Uprising around the time that it first came out, I was not a fan of it. I didn't hate it, but it certainly wasn't what I would call a good, satisfactory movie. And to be honest, upon revisiting it, that perspective hasn't really changed all that much. In fact, I still consider this film to be pretty bad. And so we're going to get into this essay video series where I will discuss why that's the case. Now, this essay video series will only be a two-parter, but boy howdy is there a lot of meat on this movie's bones to tear right into as the series goes on. Like all other essay videos that I've done in the past, as well as ones I will do going forward, I will be discussing how Pacific Rim Uprising holds up by an objective standard, with any subjective thoughts I may have on it, positive, negative, or anywhere in between, to be secondary. And then near the end of part 2, a conclusion on Pacific Rim Uprising will be assessed. So, now that the necessary introductory protocols are all out of the way, let's do a neuro handshake on this film and dive right into it. First things first, I might as well relay a bit of what this film is about. Pacific Rim Uprising is set 10 years after the events of the first movie, and it revolves around Jake Pentecost, played by John Boyega, who was the biological son of the late Stacker Pentecost, who is brought in by the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps through his adopted sister Mako Mori, reprised from the first film by Rinko Kikuchi, to coach and eventually lead a new team of Jaeger pilots, including but not limited to Amara Namani, played by Kaylee Spaney, despite the Jaeger program nearing its obsolescence in the wake of the Shao Corporation's upcoming Jaeger drone program. However, a sudden resurgence of Kaiju-related activity and a conspiracy within the Shao Corporation, orchestrated by Newt Geisler, played by Charlie Day, who has been possessed by the Precursors, results in Jake and company needing to band together and fight off an impending invasion. Okay, so now that we did a little brief synopsis on what the film was about, it makes sense for one to talk about the characters first and foremost. And good one to start with is the main one, Jake Pentecost, so why don't we get into him, shall we? Jake Pentecost is first seen essentially coasting through life while working in the black market in order to just get by, including but not limited to trading a trophy and a sports car for sustenance, as well as breaking into decommissioned Jaeger scrapyards to find Jaeger parts to sell to potential buyers. However, he runs into Amara Namani after she's stolen a piece of Jaeger tech from him for her own single-pilot Jaeger, only for the both of them to be caught and arrested. Jake is then vouched for by Mako, who offers him to lead a group of Jaeger pilots in order to be exonerated from his charges. He is begrudgingly paired up with his former co-pilot Nathan Lambert, played by Scott Eastwood, in piloting Gypsy Avenger, the Jaeger that is a successor to the first film's Gypsy Danger. However, tragedy strikes for Jake when Mako is suddenly killed during a battle with Obsidian Fury, which prompts him to fully take up his father's mantle and become the leader he and his fellow Rangers need him to be in order to save the world. The arc which Jake undergoes is how he feels inadequate due to disappointing his father and not being able to reconcile with him before he passed, and he goes on a journey to become a man who would make his father proud and to take on the role of leader to draw a line in the sand against the Kaiju uprising. It's a straightforward hero's journey, and in a vacuum, it's not badly executed. The issue, however, is that it's not in a vacuum. It's a character arc for a new character who was retconned into the Pacific Rim mythos, and that had to result in Stacker Pentecost being posthumously assassinated as a character. The reason why is because Stacker, having a son whom he never referenced in the time which we saw him alive, contradicts how he was able to effortlessly drift with Chuck Hansen in the first film. This is considering the fact that Chuck is the son of another Jaeger pilot, Herc, and this would potentially mess with Stacker during their neuro handshake. Also, since he was shown and established to be the kind of man who would care very much about the well-being of his next of kin, whether they're his blood or otherwise, Stacker would not have failed to mention or acknowledge his son during his final moments, no matter how strained the relationship was. In his final moments, Stacker would have asked for Mako or someone to find Jake and tell him that no matter what, his father loved him. Yet he didn't, and that's the problem. With the establishment of Jake Pentecost in the sequel, despite no acknowledgement of his existence in the first film whatsoever, the first film is now retroactively damaged. Now, I will say that the best aspect in Jake Pentecost as a character mainly falls on John Boyega and his performance, where he brings a lot of charisma and even some passion into the role. He's able to take some of the film's humor that isn't really all that funny on paper and make it mildly amusing, like when he anticipates what Nate's reaction would be when he announces that they will be piloting Gypsy Avenger together for Mako's summit meeting in Sydney. And as far as some of the more dramatic parts of the film, such as his speech to the cadets before they all go into battle, Boyega is able to bring a sense of passion to the scene to where he does a pretty good job emulating Idris Elba's performance as Stacker, thus selling the idea that Jake is his father's son. However, this is still similar to what he did as Finn in the Star Wars sequel trilogy, where he, as a good actor, was putting in more legwork for his role than what he was given on the page. And it's a shame that parts of the first film had to be damaged retroactively so that we could get John Boyega giving it his all in this film. Now, as far as supporting characters are concerned, there isn't really much to say about most of them. However, there is a bit to say about some of them. First off, we have Amara Namani, played by Kaylee Spaney, who serves as the film's secondary protagonist. Beyond her spunky attitude, she's had a traumatic experience where, as a child, she witnessed her parents being killed during a kaiju attack. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And as a result, she's been driven by that to prepare for the kaiju coming back. Amara is shown to be tech-savvy, as she is able to build herself a Jaeger, codenamed Scrapper, that can be run by a single pilot. Though their first meeting together wasn't on the best of terms due to the both of them ending up being detained for trying to steal a Jaeger power core and for operating an unauthorized Jaeger, Amara eventually shares a mentor-pupil bond with Jake after their first neuro handshake, and the two go on to work together in saving the world from total annihilation. Amara has a decent, albeit familiar, foundation to be a solid character. While her backstory is definitely similar to Mako Mori's, it's reasonable to say that a lot of people in the Pacific Rim universe would have their life stories changed or shaped by the Kaiju War from the first movie. Giving a new character a backstory that we've seen before in this franchise isn't inherently a bad thing. The problem, though, is that it's not properly capitalized on, in that the film doesn't give Amara's story any sense of a payoff, nor does it tie her story in with the greater picture in any meaningful way, like how the first movie did with Mako's story. The most that the film does with it after her neuro handshake scene with Jake is when we see her POV during the Shatterdome attack sequence. It seemed that the film wanted to illustrate how the chaos and carnage in the situation is taking her back to the event that killed her family, and that the fear she had of the kaiju returning has been validated. But then the film never calls back to it at any point afterwards, not even during the climax where the needed emotional catharsis for Amara would be very much warranted. Case in point, there was potential that could have been mined from in regards to Amara and her side of the story, but it's as if the film either didn't have enough time or interest to do more with her than what we got here. And when it comes to the other supporting characters of the film, well, what's there to even say about them other than what I'll be saying here? So let's just get right through them rapid fire style, shall we? Nathan Lambert starts out as having tension towards Jake after the latter makes his return as a Jaeger and even conversates with Jake during what is dubbed as the ice cream scene, which plants the seed for Jake to undergo his development as a character. Then, over the course of the film, and by the time we reach the climax, their brotherhood is essentially rekindled to full form. Rather dirt simple, and perhaps could have used the scene where Nate comforted Jake over the loss of Mako, but not much to complain about him here, so moving on. There's also a love triangle, question mark, foil for romantic tension, I guess, amongst Jake, Nate, and Jules Reyes. And I struggle to say that it was even touched upon other than in passing and in a couple very small moments. In fact, it could have easily been cut out of the film entirely and nothing would have changed. The other cadets are intended to either be new comrades for Amara or to be rivals for Amara, only for those relationships to not amount to much once we get to the climax, except for a small moment where Amara expresses relief in seeing her co-pilots from Bracer Phoenix alive and well. So, suffice it to say, the character work for the new cast of Rangers here isn't terrible, but there's still plenty of missed opportunities present, and aside from Jake and Amara, there isn't much to write home about whatsoever. Okay, so, now let's address the mega kaiju in the room and talk about how this film handles the legacy characters, as in the characters from the first film who come back here. First, let's talk about Mako Mori. But before we go into how Pacific Rim Uprising does with her, I want to go over some groundwork by discussing the character work on her from the first film. You could say that this is going to be a little mini essay, or an essay video within an essay video. So let's do this. Mako Mori underwent a strong character arc in the first film where she had to overcome her trauma after having lost her family to a kaiju attack back in her childhood. However, she was taken in by Stacker Pentecost after he slayed Onababa, the kaiju which killed her family. Mako wished to become a Jaeger pilot despite Stacker's disapproval due to his care for her safety, since he was very much like a loving father to her. However, that disapproval didn't stop her, as she became even more determined to be a pilot after she trained with Raleigh Beckett, and after he vouched for her skills in combat. When she was finally allowed to drift with Raleigh and be a co-pilot for him on Gypsy Danger, her trauma was unfortunately triggered, and it resurfaced with a vengeance, after he slipped into his own trauma from losing his brother Yancey 5 years prior. Mako's character arc crescendos and becomes complete during the Hong Kong battle, when she and Raleigh defeat Leatherback and Otachi, thus avenging her family and making Stacker proud. Then, after losing her adopted father, Mako expresses great anxiety and grief over the possibility that Raleigh didn't make it either after he closed the breach, worrying that whatever family she had left was all gone, which only hurts Jake's inclusion in Uprising even more, but I digress. However, when Raleigh is shown to be alive after all, Mako expresses relief, showcasing that not only her family, both biological and adopted, was avenged, but also that she still has a family remaining after everything is said and done, in the form of people whom she united with to defeat the precursors. Mako Mori's storyline in Pacific Rim is considered by many fans in the Kaiju community to be one of the best examples of a good to great human story in a monster movie, and for very good reason, because she really was a well-rounded character with a strong, well-executed arc that bolsters the film's overall storyline in a meaningful way. She was a hero forged from the fires of familial tragedy, and she, amongst many others, stood up to embody humanity's fighting spirit to allow it to persevere, even when the odds become all the more stacked against it by the hour. Mako Mori is a great character. So, now that we've gone over how well done Mako Mori was as a character in the first Pacific Rim, let's talk about how Uprising basically wasted her. From what I heard, particularly in an episode from the podcast The Monster Island Film Vault, where its host Nate Marchand discussed Pacific Rim Uprising with his guest, Jack G-Man Hudgens, there is a commentary track on the film, as well as tweets from Stephen S. DeKnight himself, which included him stating that killing off Mako was a decision that wasn't made lightly, and was intended to set up a potential plot thread in a third film that would pay it off, and even retroactively make her sudden death and uprising more meaningful. To which I say this: I understand that the director wanted to take the overarching storyline in the Pacific Rim saga in an unexpected direction that would become all the more clear and work better as a whole than in the sum of its parts. However, since there are no plans for Pacific Rim 3 to happen at this point, Pacific Rim Uprising is left in a very unfortunate state of having an incomplete story that made this crazy decision to sideline and basically kill off one of the first film's primary protagonists in such an anticlimactic fashion and have it exist with no payoff to vindicate it. Oh, but wait, there's more. Not only is Mako wasted as a character in Uprising, but let's keep in mind that the film doesn't even address where Raleigh Beckett is. In fact, it doesn't even say whether or not he died off screen. At least Independence Day Resurgence had its base covered in terms of why Will Smith was absent from that movie. Stephen S. DeKnight even said that Raleigh was not only supposed to come back in Pacific Rim 3, but he was also supposed to be in this film as well initially, but he wasn't because the filmmaker couldn't get Charlie Hunnam back. So with all this in mind, and considering how Pacific Rim 3 is more than likely never going to happen at this point due to Uprising's underperformance, we may as well just go ahead and conclude that Raleigh was still around in Uprising, but he never showed up. Nope. No. This is not good. Not good at all. Raleigh Beckett, considering how much he cared about Mako due to the bond they had that was built up and developed throughout the first movie, and considering what they went through together, would never have simply not shown up in the wake of her death. If anything, he would have been first in line to help Jake in getting justice for her. And upon rewatching this film for this series of mine, I took note of the scene where Jake visits the hall that has all the memorials of the deceased Rangers from the war, which includes Stacker Pentecost as well as other Jaeger pilots, including but not limited to Chuck Hansen and the pilots for Crimson Typhoon and Cherno Alpha, where we see Mako Mori has been added in with the rest due to recent events. And guess what? Raleigh Beckett is nowhere to be seen here. Considering his prolific nature as the guy who nearly sacrificed his life to destroy the precursors and to close the breach, if Raleigh died off screen during the 10-year period between the first movie and this movie for whatever reason, word would eventually have gotten out and a memorial would be placed in his honor. If he was MIA, then there should have been an explanation for where he was at or what kept him from being a participant in this film's story after Mako's death. If Raleigh was meant to come back in a later movie after all, then it would only make this movie worse because he should be in this story, no matter what. Or at the very least, there should have been an explanation for why he's not here, no matter what. Without a proper in-universe explanation for his lack of presence despite events occurring which would very much prompt that presence to be made inevitable, this film has ultimately assassinated Raleigh Beckett as a character. Good grief. That is a lot of damage to the first movie and its characters. Anyways, let's move on to another returning character who gets treated in a similar manner. Revealed as the film's antagonist, Newton Geisler, also known as Newt, is under the influence of and control by the precursors due to his frequent drifting with a kaiju brain since the events of the first movie. He's revealed to have secretly implanted kaiju DNA into Li Wenxiao's Jaeger drones to be distributed throughout the Pacific, as well as have artificially grown a kaiju brain to pilot Obsidian Fury in order to ensure the precursors' plan in striking back and attacking Earth once again. I'm gonna address this point and go much deeper into it later on in this video, but I just want to get it out there. This plan, which Newt and the precursors have orchestrated together, is utterly broken on so many levels. For now, though, let's just talk about Newt and how poorly executed he was as a character in this film. As much as I could say that Charlie Day is clearly trying in this film, he's ultimately wasted here. And as much as I understand that Newt's change of personality from what we last saw of him from the first film was due to his continued driftings with a kaiju brain over the course of a decade, and that even Guillermo del Toro himself planned on going this route when he was originally attached to the project, the execution of how this plot thread plays out leaves a lot to be desired as it is. Newt, despite his obsession with kaiju and despite being willing to take risks that most people wouldn't, was still meant to be a reasonably intelligent individual. So I would say that there's some character assassination going on with him when he lays out his true intentions to Gottlieb and Shao the way he does, right in Shao's HQ, while considering the fact that Newt and Gottlieb had to fight their way into the control room, as well as considering that by this point, Shao is made aware of what's happening, so she would be calling for extra security to apprehend the two of them. In fact, it's crazy lucky for Newt to have been able to escape to oversee the kaiju attack in Tokyo. Also, it's pretty stupid of Newt to initiate the kaiju drone attacks from Shao's HQ as opposed to, let's say, doing it from his loft in order to maintain his anonymity for at least a little while longer. But believe it or not, this only scratches the surface of what's wrong with Newt and the Precursor's endgame in this movie. Like I said, I have a whole section dedicated to it, so stick around for that. There is a neat little moment where we see a brief glimpse of Newt's real self when he shows regret for trying to strangle Gottlieb, saying that the precursors are in his head. It'd be nice if we saw a little more of that from this point forward where he's trying to fight the influence, most notably during the kaiju battle, or maybe even before this point where we could see some very subtle hints of Newt struggling with something that won't be made clear until later on. But alas, we don't get that. And considering that there's no plans for Pacific Rim 3 going on, we might as well say that we'll never get it again. Good Godzilla. Pacific Rim as a franchise was way better off as a one and done at this point. Lastly, we'd have Herman Gottlieb, played by Bern Gorman, who comes out the least scathed out of the three legacy characters by far. He does catalyze the plot point about kaiju blood by establishing it through scientific method as being both a fuel source for an in-the-works propulsion system for Jaegers, and a substance that can cause volcanic eruptions. Keep all that in mind, I'm not done with it yet. However, he remains in character to where we last saw him in the first film and remains consistent with what we understand about him, in that the things he does in this film are in line with how he's been established. He values his friendship with Newt and is saddened by the fact that Newt is no longer interested in their studies and scientific ventures like they used to due to his new career at the Shao Corporation. In the moment where he and Newt work together to get into Shao's control center, there is a moment where their friendship is seemingly rekindled, which, at least in regards to Gottlieb, hurts even more when Newt makes his true intentions known. Gottlieb even steps in as a commander figure during the climax, and it's fair to assess that, if Pacific Rim 3 were to be a reality, he would do everything in his power to save his friend from the Precursor's control. So yeah, Gottlieb is in okay shape here. Shame about the others, though. Anyways, let's conclude on the character aspect in Pacific Rim Uprising and say that things aren't looking too good so far. Now let's talk about the plot, such as it is, and the world building as we see in this film. To lend a bit of an olive branch, I appreciate that Pacific Rim Uprising wanted to go in a different direction with its plot than being just another iteration of its predecessor, kind of like what happened with Independence Day when its second film came along. However, it's one thing to have a neat idea, such as one involving Jaeger Kaiju hybrids which Guillermo del Toro thought of and which Stephen S. DeKnight incorporated into his storyline. It's another thing to take those neat ideas and execute them well, and unfortunately, that's not what happened here. First of all, the world building is a bit of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's neat to see how Jaeger technology is used and implemented post-war, and it makes sense that certain folks out there, such as those dealing in the black market or perhaps even your average Joe, would move further away from acquiring kaiju-related contents and focus more on acquiring Jaeger tech. It's also neat to see that, while not through dialogue but through reasonable inference, that Jaeger tech has become much more advanced over the course of 10 years, hence the sleeker robot designs and execution of their devices. Considering that Jaegers from the first film were built in a rush to fend off kaiju threats, hence why the machinery seemed clunkier, heavier, and less safe to use or traverse in, it makes sense that the sleeker designs and other such advancements in Jaeger tech are the results of mankind being allowed to properly build these behemoth machines during peacetime. While I would still say that the way the size and scale of the new Jaegers isn't showcased as well as what we got in the first film, I do appreciate the in-universe implications of why Gypsy Avenger, for example, is sleeker and more streamlined than the likes of Gypsy Danger. So yeah, there are some good things for me to say regarding this film's world building. Unfortunately though, there's some bad parts regarding it too. One example of poor or inconsistent world building in Uprising is that the rules regarding drift compatibility is contradicted from what the first film established. This is proven by Amara being established to not be drift compatible with any of her fellow cadets, only to suddenly be compatible with some of those cadets during the climax, when she is a co-pilot for Bracer Phoenix. Another example of this film having inconsistent world building is how it establishes, or rather re-establishes, Kaiju blood and how it works. Kaiju blood has now been retconned into being a flammable or explosive substance as deduced by Gottlieb. In the first film, Kaiju blood was never established to work that way. It's not healthy to be exposed to for a long period of time without protection, sure, but it's not something which one would use to power a rocket. If Kaiju blood was flammable in the first film to the extent to be potent rocket fuel, Gypsy Danger and her respective pilots would have been obliterated several times over by her own plasma cannon, or Striker Eureka, and by extension Herc and Chuck Hansen, would have potentially killed a whole bunch of people or themselves after blasting their cannons at Mutavore. Heck, why stop at the first movie? Let's use an example from this movie. During the Kaiju drone attack sequence, Valor Omega would have caused an explosion that would kill its own pilots, as well as Jake, Nate, Amara, and all the other cadets after shooting a Kaiju drone's head off. And I don't think I need to explain how differently the first film or this film would have ended if we were to be consistent with Kaiju blood being flammable or explosive. Just a thought. The film also establishes that a Kaiju can have its blood cause a chain reaction through the Earth when it's mixed with, as Gottlieb puts it, rare Earth elements, found only in the planet's core, which can be accessed via a volcano. Keep this in mind, I'm not done with it yet. However, the film also set up Kaiju blood as a substance which rockets can be run on. Now, I'm no rocket scientist here, but I'm pretty sure rockets don't run on any sort of rare Earth element. So since Gottlieb's new Jaeger propulsion tech requires a form of rocket fuel mixed in some way with Kaiju blood, it seems that Kaiju blood is much more easily reactive than the film wants to make us think it is. It's as if the writers established one thing, but once they got to write in the climax for the film and what the stakes are going to be in it, they failed to realize that they're providing conflicting information on how Kaiju blood is supposed to work, even within this film's own rules. At the very least, they could have established the new Kaiju in the film to be genetically engineered to where their blood would be potent enough to cause a chain reaction throughout the Earth's volcanic system, like perhaps a new blood type from what the Kaiju in the first film had. But they didn't, and they instead retconned the lore that the first film created in order to force the plot in Uprising to happen the way it does. Granted, that should be expected from this film by now, so yeah, not great stuff we got here in terms of world building. But now, let's get right into the coup de grace of issues in Pacific Rim Uprising, and alas, it is the inciting foundation of its plotline. Newt's plan to use Kaiju drones as part of a collaboration with the Precursors due to their psionic influence over him is utterly broken to a catastrophic degree. So let's list off the reasons as to why that's the case. Fasten your seatbelts, it's gonna be a wild ride. 1. The number of drones that have Kaiju DNA implanted to allow for hybridization to occur is absolutely absurd for one guy, that being Newt, to secretly accomplish. If this was a multi-personnel plot where Newt had collaborators working undercover with him who were either like him under the Precursor's influence, or shared an ideology to permit mankind's extinction, then maybe. I mean, it's not like there isn't any people out there who would welcome a Kaiju uprising based on some brief shots of protesters which we see in the film. As things are, though, Newt would never have been able to set things up like he did here because the magnitude of this operation is simply impossible for him to do by himself. It's one thing for Newt to secretly create one Kaiju Jaeger hybrid in the form of Obsidian Fury, which is only a hybrid due to the Kaiju brain piloting the thing. but several squads of kaiju drones, especially enough to spread out across the Pacific, is statistically impossible for one man to secretly make happen, even with a decade's worth of time on his side. Problem number 2. Even if we were to accept that Newt alone was enough to produce a sufficient amount of kaiju DNA to implant into Shao's Jaeger drones, and if he actually had the time to do it all, there's still such a thing as tech inspections. Considering how Lei Wen-Xiao is established to be totally driven to get her program off the ground without a hitch, as she says that she's dedicated her life to making this happen, it's safe to assess that she would want to commission an inspection on her drones every now and then, to make sure that they would end up working right in the field. And considering tech inspections would be a requirement so that the drones are fully functional and ready to go, somebody would have been inspecting these drones one day, spotted a bunch of kaiju DNA in one or more of them, and reported it. Considering that the drone program is very important to Xiao, she would want to know why there's kaiju DNA in her drones. Her finding out about this and calling for an investigation in her company, under wraps or otherwise, would rend Newt's entire plan asunder. So this begs the question, were the drones even inspected? If so, why didn't anyone detect the kaiju DNA? If there weren't any inspections before the drones got sent out, then, man, Lei Wen-Xiao is in some deep legal trouble, because that is either irresponsible or stupid of her as the head of her own company to not have her own technology be properly inspected prior to launch. In fact, she would also be in legal trouble for not commissioning any tech inspections on her drones because of the simple fact that they became kaiju drones and started an uprising and nearly ended the world. With this being the case, boy howdy, Xiao is an idiot here. Well, boy, this is already catastrophic, but wait, there's more. Problem number 3. Where and how were the drones able to have the technology that would allow them to spawn in and open up new breaches? Even with all the advancements in Jaeger tech within a decade of peacetime, there is nothing in the film to indicate that these drones, made on Earth I might add, are capable of doing this, whether there's kaiju DNA in them or not. Problem 4, and this ties in with the first movie. If prolonged drifting with a kaiju brain back in the first film was what caused Newt to be susceptible to being under the Precursor's control, then why didn't the Precursors take control of him back in the first film and prevent him from giving Stacker and company the intel needed for them to cancel the apocalypse during the climax? Considering that this film establishes that the Precursor's psionic influence over Newt had occurred since the very first time he drifted with a kaiju brain, that means the Precursors already had some form of connection to him. So what kept them from controlling him back in the first film? If the Precursors took control of Newt right then and there and stopped him from giving Stacker and company the new intel they needed to get a kaiju through the breach in order for they themselves to get in through the breach, then the Precursors would have won the war right then and there. And finally, problem number 5. If the Precursors' plan all along was to terraform the Earth and kill humanity by sending a kaiju into a volcano, as established by Gottlieb himself, then why, throughout the 12 years of their war with humanity, didn't they think to send a whole bunch of kaiju to said volcano that has rare earth elements if kaiju blood, when mixed in with said rare earth elements, can cause volcanic eruptions deadly enough to engulf the entire planet? Especially considering how mankind was putting up a fight and giving the Precursors a hard time. The first film even established that the kaiju came in waves, with the first wave being for scouting, the second for eradicating mankind's military might, and the third intended to wipe out the rest of all life on the planet and to make way for the new tenants. The first film also established that the Precursors wanted to terraform the Earth after they won the war anyways. So by the second film's logic, after scouting the planet, the Precursors should have just sent an entire legion of kaiju through the breach to overwhelm mankind and bum rush to any one of the volcanoes across the Pacific Ocean, which would have allowed the Precursors to win the war in one foul swoop. And just to make it known, it's not the first movie's fault for this, because the writing team for that movie didn't have to account for what Uprising had in store. So in conclusion, thanks to this movie, the precursors have been retroactively established as an evolutionary dead end, as opposed to the relentless and powerful force to be reckoned with that we once thought them to be in the first film, because their Uprising plan has such huge holes in them that would have resulted in it backfiring in spectacular fashion. And to close this point out, I say this. During the mid-credit scene for Pacific Rim Uprising, a mind-controlled newt proclaims that mankind's luck is going to run out. It's kind of hilarious and ironic, because it's actually him and the precursors who should consider themselves lucky that their scheme went as far as they did. Ay ay ay. We've gone through a lot regarding Pacific Rim Uprising already, just by discussing its plot and character work, and yet we still have more to discuss. But we're going to have to save that for part 2, where we'll discuss how the visual work and humor fare in this film, and in that same part, we will come to an overall conclusion on the whole thing. Hope you all stay tuned for that, and check it out when it drops. That being said, thank you for watching, and I will see you all later.